You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I'd like to talk to you about what? Whoa! No, John! Something's happening to my chair. Where am I going? Oh! John?
John is no longer here. He is a terrible villain invented for a 1980s movie.
Okay. Wow. I don't know what happened, but apparently this assembling Avengers is all fouled up already. So
it's pretty amazing to look at the film that gave us Breeders of the Lost Stork, a classic film with the character Indiana. Oh, I don't even remember at this point. But boy, what a poster collection Howard the Duck has.
He sure did.
Yeah. But like we promised, we are talking about the very first MCU movie, right? Because it's still in continuity, isn't it?
I mean, it's got to be. It's got to be. And I mean, I'm sure that ruffles some feathers by us saying that, John. But
well,
it must be said.
It must be said. I do know that this film ranks very highly. With 4 out of 4 dark overlords of the universe exploding in the Earth sky. So,
yes, it absolutely does. So, well, I mean, this is going to be really fun for us to talk about, and again, something very, very different. So I'm excited to be here to do it. So, but before we get there, of course, remember you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or those type of places where you can review us or rate us, please do. You can also find us all over social media, Twitter at the 602 Club, and then on Instagram or at the 602 Club TFM. You can also, of course, find us on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM, and they got the listeners only discussion group there. You can join and talk to listeners from all over the world, which would be great if you wanted to check that out. And of course, you can go to Trek.fm and see everything that we've got going on here on the network. All of the different shows. So, okay, John, you mentioned last episode why, you decided that we should do this. And so just would love for you to kind of reiterate your thought process. And just in case somebody missed the last episode, why in the world are we talking about Howard the Duck when this should be Infinity War week?
Well, specifically because I was showing Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom to my youngest child for the first time. And I remembered Willard Hoyk and Gloria Katz worked on that. And then, I knew that they also worked on Howard the Duck, which was a Lucasfilm production.
They did.
And I thought to myself, well, Howard the Duck appears in Guardians of the Galaxy in the Stinger, and he appears in the Stinger, and nothing has happened in the MCU that overwrites this movie, unlike Blade or the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies or anything like that.
Yep.
So it hasn't been overwritten. The character has appeared in the current MCU. Therefore, it must be an MCU movie, and also motivated then, as that thought occurs to me. This is where I reveal the rest of it. As I said to you in a text message, I'm like a suicide bomber of movie recommendations. I'm willing to blow myself up just to take you out. I had seen Howard the Duck before, and you had not. And that was my first question. It was like, have you seen it? Because I highly suspect that if you had seen it, you would have rejected my idea. But you hadn't, and so you were game.
So then I have to ask the question, when was the first time that you saw this movie? Did you go to the theater when it came out?
Oh, no. I lived in the middle of nowhere. Going to the movie theater was, when VHS, ruled the world, that was a great savior for movies for me. So I saw this on VHS at my cousin's house, and I very distinctly remember being younger than I am now, this video playing and seeing the moment where Leah Thompson's character of Beverly pulls out the prophylactic from Howard's wallet. That is like seared in my brain because my older cousin started laughing hysterically. He thought that was a great joke. And I was standing there thinking to myself, well, that's kind of gross. It's not in a wrapper. And so, there you go.
And you would be right. Well,
I mean, the clear implication is that it's like, the opening of Blues Brothers, where, it wasn't factory sealed anymore.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. Well, and you were correct. I just watched this movie today so that we could talk about it. And, I'd never seen it before. I did know, of course, that this was a film that was much maligned. Definitely a film that people, didn't seem to love. I obviously knew that this was a movie that, George Lucas was involved with the production of, as an executive producer. And so, of course, that was of interest to me because of that. This is the time when he's really not doing a ton with Lucasfilm. He's kind of pulled away a little bit. And so it was interesting to see that, they had thought about making this an animated movie, and, they realized that would take way too much time for them and would cost more money, was really the issue as to why this became live action, which I do want to ask you just about that idea. How do you, when you have the idea of this being an animated film, do you think that might have been something that people were more into? Do you think that would have helped the film at all?
No. I remember reading the book George Lucas, The Creative Impulse, which I actually, because I remembered it in relation to this movie, I found a used copy, and I was like, I haven't read that in a few dozen years, so I wanted to go ahead and reread that. And I mean, the book is basically like a hagiography of George Lucas at the time. He never did anything wrong. He healed the sick and helped lame beggars walk, sort of thing. But, it still actually had a section where they discussed Howard the Duck. But the way it was painted was, well, George was doing it as a favor to his friends. They didn't really, he wasn't really that involved. But if you watch the behind the scenes stuff with Howard the Duck, the story is completely different. They're basically like, yeah, George found the comic book Howard the Duck, and he thought it was funny as hell, and he was like, we should make a movie out of this. And so they decided to make a movie out of it. And it's like I kind of admire that because it's kind of fun. He'd worked with them before, great success, all that sort of thing. And I'm sorry for rambling about it at that point, but in terms of an animated movie, this only works as an animated movie if you're going to do something like Cool World or Fritz the Cat or Heavy Metal,
or even maybe Who Framed Roger Rabbit type of thing.
Yeah, that would. You're right. That would be the sort of thing you could do with this too. That would have, I think, that going the Roger Rabbit way. I like the way you're thinking, because I'm not thinking blending of live action and animated like that. I think you're right. That probably would have worked better. I'm thinking strictly in terms of animated feature, in which case this would have had to have been like an R-rated animated feature, and the market for that is not exactly,
it's true,
big.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people who think, what I really want today is an R-rated animated movie, at least at the time, right? We have them now in the sense that some of those straight to DVD and or Blu-ray, whatever you want to call it these days, that's out. You get those that for like the DC films, the animated ones, and they have more blood and that kind of thing in them, and they're definitely for adults. But I mean, they're also just coming out at home. We're not releasing them to the general public, and in the sense of like we're trying to put it in the theater and make people accept this. It's already people who are interested. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the aforementioned, like, Fritz the Cat and Howard and Heavy Metal are, they're niche movies. They're cult classics. But it's a very limited appeal on them. Very, very limited. And that becomes a very interesting thing because, having that discussion, I mean, wouldn't that have been a great way for sort of like Lucas to be a trailblazer sort of thing? Is like, I'm gonna like he could have been, I guess, sort of like an antidote to Disney by doing that sort of thing. But as much as we might talk about Lucas as an independent filmmaker, he very much has a more wholesome sensibility, I think, than, or at least, in terms of the movies he makes. But
well, and I think, like you're saying, that's one of the reasons why when we talk about the adaptation, and of course, yes, they do this as a live action, but, one of the things about the adaptation is that it is much different than the comic in the sense that, like, Howard is a character, from what I've read, that is much more sarcastic. There's the whole comic is very sardonic from what I've been able to read about. And so because of that, they don't do that in this film. And, Howard in many ways is a much more likable character, which is a very interesting thing to do. And I wonder in some ways if that honestly doesn't, I wonder if that has any effect on like the story as well. If it might have been received better if this felt maybe more like a satire than it does. Because this is more played very straight, which is really interesting that they play this so straight when it is so it's so surrealistic, really. The whole idea is just surreal. And I'm very surprised that instead they kind of play this just not in a way that I would have expected.
Well, I almost wonder if there were a different director who had that sensibility. If you got like a John Landis or even a Zemeckis would have, I think, infused that sort of sense of humor into it. I get much more the sense that and again, yes, I always butcher his last name. I apologize 1,000 times over. I have nothing but respect for him, but I always get I don't know how to pronounce his last name properly. Willard Hoyk. I think that's how you say it. I don't think he was the right director for this. And there's no shame in saying he's a great screenwriter, but not the right director for this. And I think that they understood the sensibility of it. They got it. But you needed somebody who knew, what, a Joe Dante would have been right for this too, like Gremlins. You need that type of sensibility behind the camera. And I don't think that he had it. And I think that works against the movie. But at the same time, I want to ask you about this, right? This is in danger right now of entering into that cult classic territory where people remember it much more fondly than they did back when it was released. I got to ask you, this is your first viewing. What was the general, what zone did it land in? What the hell is going on? Who thought this was a good idea? Or, oh, this is an 80s comedy sort of thing. Like, what was your sort of vibe from it while you were watching it for the first time?
Honestly, it feels like something that comes from the 80s. It just feels like something that makes sense for the 80s. And kind of watching it, I think I was able to view the film in that lens, because there are so many movies that take weird chances like this in the 80s in a way that we just don't do anymore. And, it does feel like a lot of those, interesting choices that Lucasfilm kind of makes, trying things that don't necessarily always work, which, I think is one of the strengths of Lucasfilm in general, was that George was willing to do that, and if he had a failure, like, he learned from it and he moved on. But I mean, this comes from the same company that, made things like Willow and that kind of stuff. So, this feels very much in line with all of that type of thing. And the 80s had that surrealist sensibility where it really would blend things that don't go together at all, in a way that I just don't know that we do today. Like you said, like a Cool World did, or Who Framed Roger Rabbit. That's legitimately the same type of sensibility that we're getting in this type of this movie, right? They're doing the same stuff. And, I think I went in with such low expectations. I think that the movie maybe surprised me in the sense that it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, which is always a great place to be. And, it's not like I hated watching it. I just didn't. It had some, like, let me put it this way. For this movie to, like, keep my interest for 2 hours without me getting completely bored and just thinking, like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen, that's a win, So and it's not a movie I wouldn't say that I wouldn't watch again either.
I think it exists in the realm of interesting failure. Mm-hmm. Which I know sounds like a terrible thing, but there are a lot of interesting failures that I will revisit through time because of the fact that you're fascinated by it. It's not a train wreck. It's not anything terrible. And to your point, I readily acknowledge, and I think it's a great point for you to make in the context of this discussion, that it's from an era of filmmaking where people just threw spaghetti at the wall and said, "What the hell? Let's try it. What do we got to lose?" Right? Oh, the movie didn't do so great. Okay. That's fine. And maybe the commoditizing of things, ironically, by Disney with the MCU, as we've encountered it, has sort of sapped some of that insane sort of creativity from movies in general, because we're so concerned about continuity and believability and stuff like that.
Well, and there's a surrealistic nature to this in the same way I think that Guardians has in some ways, right? Like, and of course, Howard the Duck is where we saw we saw Howard the Duck in Guardians in the first place. So I think that's obviously makes sense that if anybody would ever try and do this again, you could see, like, I think Gunn trying to bring a Howard the Duck film back with his sensibilities, and you feel like he could make that work, right? Because I think he has what this movie kind of needed, as you talked about with the director, of this idea of being more cynical, I think being a harder edge to it, all of those things I think would make this movie and the movie itself probably work a little bit better. But, at the same time, I was kind of struck in here that the storyline really is about two people connecting over the fact that they don't feel like they're in the place that they thought they would be in life. And they really don't honestly know how to get there. And they help each other kind of find their place. And of course, it's really weird because it's happening between a duck and a woman. But I think at its core, it's a really what's weird to say is it's actually this really sweet story of these people helping each other find themselves.
Yeah, I'll say that if this went, there are a couple of structural things, I think, and this is why it sits in the realm of interesting failure, is there are just some relatively minor changes that could have happened within the context of the screenwriting stage that I think could have made this a legitimately good movie, or at least more accessible. Don't start on Duck World. Have Howard basically start with the science lab and have him land at the science lab, but nobody notices it. He lands outside of it or something. I think that opening is much better because you're not starting off with this gag of an egg-shaped world where you're like, what is going on here? And then if you really want to show his planet, you can show it in flashback, right?
Sure.
Then I think what would have made it a more 80s feature and a safer play with a lot of audiences is if instead of her reaffirming her love for Howard at the very end of the movie, instead have her and Tim Robbins wind up being the ones who fall in love. And Howard's okay with that, right? Like that I think would have played a lot better with audiences.
Sure. Sure.
And the thing is, I want to give it all of the credit that you're giving it about, this is two people who don't know where they're going in life, and it plays like that. But I do think it's just an insurmountable story element to have this quasi-animatronic duck and this teenage girl falling in love with each other. Sure. It's like, it's just a bridge too far.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, it did that. Yeah, that point really does ruffle too many feathers. It's like you can't. You're absolutely right to say that is. We can't build a bridge over that much water,
Right.
Like there's just no. You can't get there in your mind, and. I think that's the thing that helps something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the fact that Roger's married to Jessica. They're cartoons. So there's already a leap of imagination in the sense that they're cartoons, so it doesn't feel quite as weird. Whereas here, because he's like a lifelike duck that walks and talks. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it must be Howard the Duck. Anyway, yeah, I'm sure somebody's made that joke before. I'm sorry. But, and, she's a real person. It's, Leah Thompson has made a habit of being in films in really awkward situations. First with her son. And Back to the Future, and now with a duck. I don't know what it is about her, but that's interesting. So,
well, I think she's an actress, and looking at the behind the the looking back documentary type of stuff. What's really nice is that she has a very fond memory of this movie, and a very it apparently tied into her sense of humor.
Yeah,
and she's like, she got the joke.
Well, and it makes sense because that's exactly how she feels about Back to the Future 2.
Yeah.
She's the exact same way about that film, which is not a great film.
It's better than the first one, but the thing with Howard the Duck,
100% false. Please stop.
It's at least it's fine. It's not better than the first one. I admit that, but it is better than the third one.
That's not true either, but that's a different story.
Yeah, it is. There's a law of diminishing returns with that trilogy.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, I think that her sense of humor, like, she's so earnest in this movie. She really is trying to sell the role. I do think a lot of it is the structural stuff undercuts it. It's one of those things where I don't like the movie, but I have a hard time hating the movie. Like, for me to hate a movie, I have to feel betrayed by it in some way. That it just failed so badly that I feel like it just broke the gentleman's handshake of, I'm not going to mess with you too bad, and I'm paying money for it, so let's have a time. There are movies I hate,
sure,
but this is not a movie I can hate because, again, Leah Thompson's really in earnest. Tim Robbins is fine. Jeffrey Jones his character arc is just so weird. It's so bizarre. There's so many different ways you could have done X, Y, or Z with everything. And so I think it really is just one of those things where it's, there are too many structural things working against it for it to be good. But because Leah Thompson wants to be there and is trying her best, because Tim Robbins is giving it his all, because Ed Gale, I think that's his name, the little person who was in the suit, he's a good physical actor. He made Howard work as an effect. And so like all of these things, that's why it's so tough to muster up any negative energy toward the movie, because it's like it's just honest in its intentions, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, because like you said, the film, you can tell what the film is trying to do. And I think what you said about kind of the structure of the movie, I felt like the first half of the movie is better than the second half, because it feels like we're telling a certain type of story in the first half of the film, and then we go into special effects world where we're just trying to do cool special effects. And part of that is, bringing in the demons from beyond and everything. And I think that's something to where, like you said, there needed to be maybe a better way to put that together.
Now, see, what's really interesting about that with the bringing in the dark overlords of the universe is, if you take them out of this story, this is basically just E.T. with a duck.
Yeah.
And I have to wonder if that's not playing in the back of their brains at some point.
Sure.
We can't just make E.T. with a duck. We have to do something that sets us apart, aside from the implied sexual situations. And, well, I mean, isn't that enough to set it apart from E.T., really? When you think about it. But in all seriousness,
yes,
right?
Yes, it is.
Like, you can't just have him racing against the cops to go back to the machine that's going to send him back home, because then you have no choice but to send him back home.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have any story elements that are any different. And so maybe it's just they're just undone by their own desire not to be seen as copycats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be. And I think the other thing that they're trying to do in many ways is to keep they're keeping themselves open for a sequel, and they want a good reason for Howard to not be able to go home. And so the way they come up with that is these overlords. And, I just think that possibly what it needs is that you want everything to just feel more cohesive in the storytelling. And again, I just feel like the first half of the movie feels much more cohesive.
Yeah.
And the second half feels like it's just kind of action beat after action beat, and loses a lot of that momentum. And part of that, I think, is like you were saying, is one of the things that held this movie together beforehand was Leah Thompson, like Mark Hamill, making you believe that Howard is a real person and that she has feelings for it, as weird as that is. And somehow that makes the movie work beforehand. Yeah. And it works less when you're watching Howard become an action hero at the end. That doesn't feel quite as legitimate.
Yeah. I mean, that's this movie in a nutshell. You know, like what stunned me seeing it, because I wouldn't have noticed this at the time, because it's literally been decades since I've watched this, is that the music is John Barry.
Yep.
Who worked on the Bond films, for Pete's sake.
Yes, he did.
I'm like, wait, what? But what's interesting is listening to the music, it sounds like his Bond work. Mm-hmm. Like it really does. I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing or even a good thing. It's just I can tell it's a John Barry score. I'm like, well, that's just a little asynchronous with everything, you know? But in terms of like the design, what did you think of the design of everything?
I mean,
but most especially the Cajun sushi diner.
Okay, so design-wise, I mean, like Duck World was really cool. I mean, it looked really good. They obviously spent a lot of time creating that, and I was actually impressed that was the case, because it's on screen for so little time. And so that was, I mean, again, and two, having, you know, all of the people in the suits and everything and really filling that out was astounding work. I mean, when I think of what they're doing at the time they're doing it, this is a lot of work. A lot more work than I think people probably realize that they would put into a film. You know, today everything is just CGI, you know, and not that that's not a lot of work, but it's not the same type of work as like painfully building these suits for people to wear, and, you know, the work they're doing about pulling him through all those walls and everything. And, you know, it's crazy. You know, the rest of the film, I think they do a pretty good job. I mean, you can obviously see at the end of the movie, you got Phil Tippett and his, you know, stop motion animation, which is always cool to see, even if it doesn't hold up in the sense of the lighting is wrong on.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you get in a set that detail, like it's a lot different for a Tauntaun or an AT-AT Walker, where there's a very quasi monochromatic thing behind it. But there's so much different light sourcing and shadows in the real world in an interior environment like that when you comp in something like that, like you understand when you look at it, you're like, that is so cool. They did so much work. It looks really neat. But you can tell that that's like a two-dimensional flat photography thing thrown over on top of something else. And that works against it. And it's unfortunate because I thought the design of the Dark Overlord of the Universe, what was wild about it was it's a creepy design, but it's also comic booky enough not to be terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? It's kid scary. And I think that's an achievement. The movement on it's great, but the lighting is just impossible to really get right when you're comping those sorts of things, when you have such a complex background with so many different shadows and surfaces.
Yeah, no, I mean, I 100% agree with you on that. And, you know, I think, you know, the rest of the film looks very much like a kind of a classic 80s movie. You know, it's very location based, and all of that stuff I think works just fine. There wasn't anything that really stood out to me as like, oh, that looks terrible, you know, so.
The rolling hills of Ohio.
Yes, exactly.
You know, that's always
yeah.
Just for anybody who doesn't realize, Ohio's not exactly known for its topography. Like there aren't a lot of elevated places. It's sort of like you know, sea level in the Midwest sort of thing. So just some of the locations that they chose, I'm like, all right, guys, you're not in Ohio anymore. Come on now.
But yeah, I mean, you know, overall, I mean, you know, this isn't a movie we're going to talk about forever.
No.
But I mean, I think you said it really well, that this movie is an interesting failure. And it's not the worst movie I've ever seen. You know, I've seen people just rate it on, you know, Letterboxd and stuff at like half a star, and it's like, this is not half a star. I've seen movies way worse than this, and in fact I might have seen MCU movies worse than this, so who knows. So I guess maybe, John, I don't know, unless you have anything to add, possibly we should get to our ratings.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get to our ratings, because honestly, I don't know how much more. There's only one final note. That dumb song at the end stays stuck in your brain for a solid 24 hours.
It's pretty
welcome to that.
Yeah, that's there. Thank you. Yeah.
It will not go away. And Leah Thompson still has the Les Paul guitar that she learned to play for this movie. So God bless her. Yeah, I'm ready to give my rating. It's going to be kind of generous because it's a failure, but it's an interesting failure. It's something that I can look at and I can be like, yep, I see what went wrong there. And I can almost like intellectually distance myself from the emotional trauma of watching it. And once you work past certain things, you're like, yeah, that gag's kind of cute. That's fine. It's not really funny, but it's like, okay. So I wind up coming in, believe it or not, and I know everybody's going to get mad at me, especially since I said Back to the Future Part 2 is better than Back to the Future Part 3, but it is. I'm going to go ahead with 2 stars for this. What about you?
Nice. Well, I think then you'll think that I'm being ultra generous when I give this 2.5 stars.
Really?
Yeah, because I think that this is half a good movie. I think they were really doing something interesting in the first half of the film, and the last half of the film loses me in the sense that it just... I think what it tries to do is tries to be too big for its own britches, and that's where it loses me. But, I mean, maybe it'll go down when I watch it again, but... I think one of the things is that I was kind of impressed with the effects work for the most part, and what they were able to do with the way Howard looks in the first place was pretty impressive for the time. I mean, animatronic creations like that weren't what we have today, where, the new Star Wars movies have, I mean, you can have an animatronic Maz Kanata, and it's hard to tell whether or not she's real or not, Yeah,
although that made such little sense to do in Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, I don't know why they did that.
It was kind of maddening.
Yeah, but again, I mean, it's still impressive what you can do. You can make these things so lifelike. Or you think about the Book of Boba Fett with the Ithorian mayor, really impressive work. And this is in the 80s. So, yeah. So, John, if we're going to put this with our MCU rankings, then what I'm super fascinated to see is where this lands.
Yeah, that is going to be super fascinating because I'm not quite sure. Spoilers, we're going to get pretty deep into the list before I put Howard the Duck in there. Okay, so just hang on for the ride here. Yeah. All right, Captain America, the Winter Soldier, obviously. Iron Man 3, Ant-Man, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Iron Man, Black Panther, Guardians of the Galaxy, Doctor Strange, Captain America Civil War, Captain America the First Avenger, The Incredible Hulk, Thor, Spider-Man Homecoming, The Avengers, Howard the Duck, Thor the Dark World, Iron Man 2, Thor Ragnarok, and Avengers Age of Ultron. Because Howard the Duck, again, is not a cynical failure or a failure by committee, but an interesting failure. And so that's where it sits on the list.
Yeah. Okay. So, The Winter Soldier, Iron Man 3, Civil War, The First Avenger, Black Panther, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, The Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man Homecoming, Guardians of the Galaxy, Avengers, Thor the Dark World, Iron Man 2, Thor, Howard the Duck, Avengers Age of Ultron, and Thor Ragnarok. This means that I would rather watch... Howard the Duck is the film that I would rather watch than those two movies.
I can honestly say because of Leah Thompson's earnestness, that's why it beats out what it does on my list.
Yeah,
because again, those other four they're like offensively bland in some sense. Mm-hmm. This is interestingly bad. So that's an important distinction for me.
There's a possibility that I could put this maybe above Thor, but then I had to think to myself, but Thor did have Darcy in it being really funny, and it has Sif in it, and so, they're trying in the movie. So, anyway.
I don't know that Darcy is funny. That might be the problem there, but I rank Thor higher than you do.
Yes, you do. So,
yeah.
Well, that was really fun. I think an interesting diversion, but we are back on target. We're staying on target, John. Next is Infinity War. So, before we get there, where can everybody find you, John, if they wanted to catch up with you and talk about how excited they were that you had us cover Howard the Duck?
Well, I fully expect everybody to send me thank you letters for covering Howard the Duck. You can find me as Kessel Junkie online, KESSELJUNKIE, and on the Nerd Party Network, I'm co-hosting 2 shows. The first one I will mention is called House Lights, where we look at the work of film directors. And then, of course, Aggressive Negotiations, a delightful Star Wars podcast that I co-host with you, Matt Rushing.
And you can find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero, all those type of places. Of course, here on the network in the 602 Club, the main feed, doing the main show, as well as Snyder Cuts with you, John. We talked about everything that Zack Snyder directed. You can also find me doing The Orb, Literary Treks, and Warp 5. The Orb is about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Literary Treks is about the books and the comics of Star Trek, and Warp 5 is about Star Trek Enterprise. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, when I'm not doing Aggressive Negotiations, you can check out a finished show I had with Drea Kaufman as we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. But thank you so much for joining us.
Avengers!